All right, today we are going to talk about doing operations with radical expressions. So the first ones we're going to look at are combining like radicals. So in A, I have radical 2 plus 3 radical 2. So since they both have a radical 2 or a square root of 2, that means I can combine what's out front. So out front of my first one, in front of this one right here, there's really a 1 there. So I'm going to take 1 plus 3, which will give me 4. And then I'm going to bring down my radical 2. If I look at the second one, B there, I have negative 3 radical 5 minus 4 radical 5. So they both have a radical 5, so I can combine what's out front. Negative 3 minus 4 gives me negative 7 radical 5. Now, if they do not have a common radical, we have to first simplify one of them in order to get a common like radical. So the first one I can leave as 7 radical 3, and I can simplify radical 12 by taking it as radical 4 times 3, and I can take 7 radical 3 minus the square root of 4 is 2 radical 3. So all I'm doing right now is just simplifying that radical 12. Then, now they both have a radical 3 with them, so I can take 7 minus 2, which is 5, and then bring down my radical 3. So again, in B, I don't have a common radical or a common like radical, so I can make that 20 and I can simplify it so it is a radical 5. So I'm going to have 3, and then I have my radical 20, and I'm going to write that as 4 times 5, because 4 is a perfect square, plus 2 radical 5. So if I take the square root of 4, I get 2, so I'm going to take 3 times 2, which is 6 radical 5, and I'm going to add 2 radical 5 to that. So 6 plus 2 will give me 8, and I bring down my radical 5. All right, the next one is to multiply. So we're going to use the distributive property here. So I'm going to take radical 3 and I'm going to multiply it by radical 6. And I'm going to take radical 3 and multiply it by 7. I'm going to distribute it out. So radical 3 times radical 6 is, I can multiply 3 times 6 and I get 18, and I leave it underneath the radical. Then I'm going to take radical 3 and multiply it by 7. Now, I can't take 3 times 7, so I'm going to put the 7 out front and leave the radical 3 behind it. So 7 radical 3, because that's 7 times radical 3. Now, we can simplify 18. So 18 is 9 times 2. 9 is my perfect square. So the square root of 9 is 3, and I leave my radical 2, plus 7 radical 3. Now, the number underneath the radicals are not the same, so I cannot combine these. I'm just going to leave it just like that. 3 radical 2 plus 7 radical 3. All right, if I look at B, this time I'm distributing that radical 2x. So radical 2x times radical 6x is, I'm going to take 2 times 6, which is 12. So this is all underneath a radical. And x times x, which is x squared. And then that negative 11 doesn't have a radical, so out front is going to be negative 11 times radical 2x. But I need to simplify this first term. So I can write 12 as 4 times 3 and x squared. So the square root of 4 is 2. The square root of x squared is x. And then I have a radical 3 minus 11 radical 2x. Again, underneath the radical is not the same, so I can't combine them together. All right, and if we look at these last two, So I have the quantity 2 square root of 6 plus 3 square root of 3 times the quantity square root of 6 minus 5 square root of 3. So I'm going to take this 2 square root of 6 and I'm going to multiply it by radical 6 minus 5 radical 3. And I'm going to do the same thing with that 3 radical 3. Okay, so if I take 2 radical 6 times radical 6, that will give me 2 radical, and then 6 times 6 is 36. Then I take 2 times negative 5, because those are both out front, so that gives me a negative 10. And then radical 6 times radical 3 is radical 18. So you can only multiply things that are either outside of the radical together or underneath the radical together. So when I take 3 radical 3 times 6, I'm going to take 3 and multiply it by what's out front, which is 1. And then 3 times 6, which is 18. And now I'm going to do 3 times negative 5, so negative 15. And then 3 times 3, which they're both underneath radical, which is 9. So if I just start to simplify, I get 2 times radical 36, which is 6. So I'm going to write this 2 times 6. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to combine these two terms because they both have a radical 18. So that's going to be negative 10 plus 3, which is a negative 7, and radical 18. And then minus 15, and radical 9 is 3. Okay, so then if I just keep simplifying, I get 12. And then I need to take negative 7, and I'm going to break this down. So that's going to be 9 times 3. And if I multiply these together, I'm going to get a minus 45. Okay, keep simplifying. So I can combine these, the 12 and the 45 together. So that's going to give me a minus 30, whoops, should be a 33. And then minus, I'm going to have 7 times 3 because the square root of 9, so minus 21 radical 3. All right, so we're going to do the same thing on this next one because I can write this as the square root of 7 plus 4 times the square root of 7 plus 4. So I'm going to take the square root of 7 and I'm going to multiply it by square root of 7 plus 4. And I'm going to take plus 4 and multiply it by the square root of 7 plus 4. So the square root of 7 times the square root of 7, multiply what's underneath to get 49. And then multiply it by 4, and I get 4 square root of 7. Do the same thing, distribute that 4, so plus 4 radical 7, and 4 times 4 is 16. So if I keep simplifying, I get the square root of 49 to be 7. Combined my two like terms right there because they both have a square root of 7. So plus 8 radical 7. And now I can combine my 16 and 7 to get 23 plus 8 radical 7. Now 7 can't be simplified any farther. There's no perfect squares that I can take out of there. So I'm going to leave it as 23 plus 8 radical 7. And there is doing operations with radical expressions.